we're on episode 5, where we're looking at Goswijn van der Weyden, St Catherine and the Philosophers. Rachel, your work on Southampton's Nutsi led to further collaboration between the two institutions. Can I ask you why you agreed to look at the Nutsi on condition that you could also simultaneously work on this painting here by Goswijn van der Weyden?
Well, most of my work at the National Gallery in the 1990s had been studying works from the Northern Europe, from the Netherlands and Belgium, from the 15th and 16th centuries, because we were working on a great scholarly catalogue. And I had totally fallen in love with Roger van der Weyden. But we didn't have in our collection any paintings attributed to Goswijn, or Goswijn, his grandson. And so when I heard that Southampton had one, I really wanted to look at it to see whether we could track anything that he might have learned from his grandfather, who he would never have known. His grandfather died before he was an artist himself.
So it was a wonderful opportunity for you. That's very nice that you got something out of the fact that Southampton had Goswijn van der Weyden. So why did you ask permission, though, to take the painting back to London rather than examining it in its home in Southampton, Rachel?
Well, when we looked at it in the stores in Southampton, it was clear that there was quite a lot that we could find out about it. Infrared reflectography showed us that there was a lot going on the inside surfaces, but also the backs of the wings were intriguing and interesting. But I thought that if we could get the painting to London, then I could mount it on an easel that allowed me to make the infrared much more easily. And also possibly we could add a few more bits of technical examination. For example, I offered that we could do an X-ray of it. And that might tell us more. And I was also hoping that I would be able to entice my friends and colleagues in the scientific department to help me with studying what pigments had been used and just do a much more complete technical examination than would have been possible.
So really you were trying to put more heads onto it than one. So when you got the Goswijn van der Weyden, St Catherine and the Philosophers to London, when you got your various bits of scientific equipment onto it, you were talking to your colleagues. Rachel, can you tell us, did you find anything of interest as a result of your technical examinations?
Yes, well, I mean, as I said, we had discovered in Southampton that it would be worth studying in greater detail. And the infrared reflectography showed us not just clear underdrawing, but also that even after he'd started to outline exactly where he was going to put the composition, he then, as he was painting, he made changes. So this section that I've chosen to illustrate here, if you look first of all at the man sitting in the foreground, you can see some black lines around his eyes, around his mouth, and also in the area where his hat is. And I hope you can see that his hat was initially designed to be a turban. And at a later stage, the Goswijn has simplified it and made it into a much more simple sort of pillbox hat.
And then I can see a figure, a black figure, above the hat with his hands raised, Rachel, that I can't see on the final version of the painting in the detail we see on the left. Can you explain about that and how the technologies allowed you to see that?
Yes, well, this was what I was saying about how not only did we see underdrawing, but we also saw changes that were made while the artist was painting. And in this case, we have a whole string of people coming along the edge of the, by the water. And the reason that they're showing a sort of black silhouettes is that they have been painted with paint that contains something that the infrared shows. But then they've been covered over with green and blue, the grass and the sea, so that we can no longer see them in the final painting, but they had been painted, and there are a lot of changes also in the other figures behind the wall. You can see possibly as the people in the picture, there's a man with his hand holding a piece of paper. If you look at the infrared to the left of where the hand is holding the paper, you can see another hand.
Oh, yes.
And so that those people were leaning further over the
parapet wall, yes. Absolutely.
And that again is something that had reached a painting stage. He'd gone quite a long way with the figure in that position before he changed his mind.
So it really does show us the artist's intention at earlier stages before the final decisions were made and the final paint was put over the surface. How absolutely fascinating. Well, can you also tell us what you found out as a result of your further research? In particular, I'm thinking that I remembered in conversations with you that you were very keen about what you found on the shield, about the shields on the back of the painting.
Well, yes, as I mentioned, it was tantalizing that the backs of the wings had been painted sort of black-brown, but somebody had started to try and clean a little bit off one of them, and you could begin to see that possibly there was something there that the black paint was hiding. And with the infrared, and we saw this in Southampton, but weren't able to make a proper a lasting image of it. We saw it live. But when we got the picture to London and I made the proper reflectograms, this is what we found. So
a lot more information about these shields lurking under the surface.
So we found these shields. Indeed, you can see very clearly that under the completely black right-hand wing, there's a shield with 3 very clear birds on it, on a black ground. And on the other more damaged one, the same shield appears, but quartered with a different coat of arms.
Yeah, because it appears in the top left quadrant.
And the bottom right.
And the bottom right, yes.
So then we got the X-rays back, and remember the quartered shield?
Oh, yes.
This is the X-ray of that same area.
My gosh, it looks completely different.
It is completely different. And so that showed us, and it's less easy to see, which is why I'm not demonstrating the other one, but there is another, that there are shields hidden underneath these shields. So we've had a series of things piled on top of each other, and then the black paint on top of everything. And so then, of course, we wanted to know if we could identify what these shields were. And in order to do that, we need to know what the colours are.
Of course, because obviously these images are purely black and white, and therefore it's a bit harder to differentiate what the original shields were. Exactly. So how did you find out what the colours were?
So, well, the next stage was that I spent hours and hours looking at the surfaces using a stereo binocular microscope.
Is that the instrument we can see in you in the photograph?
That's me with the exact instrument, but obviously not looking quite at the same picture. But and so, if you remember, that the things were basically black with a few holes. So I was only able to look down a few holes, but I made these maps where I was trying to make a note to myself of what colours I could see down the holes.
Wonderful.
And that allowed us to get a lot further.
And I can see you've got on this diagram red, gold leaf, silver, black, silver, and so on. So you're able to map the colours onto your drawings.
Exactly. And my wonderful colleagues in Scientific came and took a couple of absolutely tiny micro samples, which they were able to mount as cross sections, which allowed us to see which colours were in which layer.
Got you to which shield they belong.
Exactly. And so, putting all this information together, I drew up some diagrams of what I thought the shields were that we had found.
That's absolutely amazing. So with your X-ray, infrared, your analysis of the colours, your help from other colleagues, you ended up with 4 shields. Can you tell us what they were? This one looks rather familiar on the far left.
Well, this was the biggest shock of all, and that the easiest one to identify is the arms of the University of Oxford.
Yes.
In England. And the one that was at the same level on the other wing, which is the second one along in the image, is the shield of one of the founders and benefactors of St. John's College, Oxford.
How fascinating. So before you were able to prove that these, what the shields were, we had no idea that the painting in Southampton actually belonged to a member of St. John's College in Oxford.
Exactly. So that it was so exciting and totally unexpected. We were thinking we were going to have to sift through large books of Belgian dignitaries,
yes,
to try and find the coats of arms.
Exactly.
And we instantly got
a hit,
an English connection, and these are at the lowest level, and then the shields one level up are also an English family.
So that meant that the painting painted by a Netherlandish painter actually had this very early provenance in the UK.
Exactly, yes. We can't be certain that it was somebody from Oxford who had commissioned it. He may have bought it off the peg, but he then wanted to establish his ownership of it and had his shields painted on it. And then when ownership transferred to some other family, they painted out his ownership and declared their own.
They wanted to put their own ownership mark on top. Well, Southampton must have been absolutely delighted with your findings, and indeed you published them, didn't you, Rachel?
Yes, indeed. We wrote everything up and published it in the National Gallery Technical Bulletin, which means that if anyone wants to read more about it, they can download a free PDF version of the article just from the National Gallery website.
So everybody can share in your scholarship. How wonderful. Just to finish, you did your work there, but can you tell us a bit about the fact that when you deframed the painting to do your work, something happened that then led on to another collaboration?
Oh yes, when we got the painting to London, Rebecca and I were removing the frame so that I could start my study. And as we unscrewed the clasps that were holding the painting down, the panel just groaned as it was released.
You actually heard a noise?
Yes. And so it was obvious that the frame that it was in was totally unsuitable for it and was restricting it in a way that is not right for a wood panel. And so I suggested to Rebecca that we mustn't put it back in that same frame. She must try and find some way of getting a more suitable frame for it to go back to Southampton in.
And then as a result of your suggestion, another now colleague of ours at the National Gallery, Isabella Kocum, was invited to make a frame, wasn't she, Rachel? So now I'm going to be talking to Isabella about that framing episode. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Well, it's lovely to have Isabella Kocum, the framing expert from the National Gallery, who was involved with making a wonderful new frame for Southampton's painting of the Van der Weyden triptych. So, Isabella, can you tell us first what were the challenges associated with undertaking the making of a new frame for the Van der Weyden triptych?
Well, sourcing the best possible frame profile to keep the panel safe and incorporate the hinges for closing mechanism. The joiner and Flemish frames is complex and traditionally made by panel makers or carpenters in oak wood.
Aha, so then to make your new frame for an historical picture, Isabella, did you use any particular historical frames as models or a guide to help you?
Yes, I used an existing Flemish profile from the triptych by Hans Memling. The frame profile description and construction are in a book called Quatre supports dans la peintre flamande au 15e et 6e siècle by Helen Verkostraat de Mark and Roger van Schouten. This is a wonderful helping guide for Flemish frame reproductions.
And is that the book that we can see on screen,
That's right,
Isabella?
yeah.
Yes.
You see all the details. You got drawings of profiles and joinery, everything. It's fabulous.
So that was very helpful when you came to making your choices.
Oh, brilliant, yes.
And then why, can you tell the audience a bit more about why triptych frames were used for works of art?
Well, in Northern Europe, the triptych frame enabled the opening and closing of the side wings, and fitted with metal hinges and often with a closing and locking mechanism. The frame profile is also specially designed to close the wings and keep the paintings apart so they don't touch each other, acts as a spacer. The closed triptych was protected the painting from climate. Half open wings gave the worshipper privacy and shielded the candles from wind. And fully open triptych often was in celebration of religious festivities. The wings allowed for all functions, and the painters used the opportunity to decorate both sides. When closed, the painting was kept in somber colors in contrast to an open, it's really fully colored. Wow effect.
Wonderful. That's absolutely great. So how did you think that the frame now helps the public to understand more about its sort of three-dimensional space and the logic of the loggia recorded?
Well, I would say that this reproduction frame was not meant to mislead the framer in pretending to be the original frame, but has all attributes to what the frame might have looked like. The unassuming Flemish frame, traditionally in black and gold, complements the painting in color and style. The frame is also totally appropriate for the painting, as in the width of the internal members allows the viewers to interpret the architectural space as Van der Weyden would have originally intended.
Thanks very much, Isabella, for explaining your wonderful new frame. I think now that when visitors go around Southampton and see your frame around the old painting, they'll have a better understanding of some of the choices you had to decide on when you made your frame. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.